Hey, my name is Rusty Corhonen and I've got a story for you. I spent a lot of summers as a kid with my grandparents, and one particular summer I was big enough I could bring my bike with me, and I couldn't wait to get up there and ride the trails. I had a Schwinn Stingray with a banana seat and I absolutely loved this bike. Well, my dad dropped me off, and right after he left, we noticed my tires were a little flat, so I couldn't ride them, and my grandfather didn't have a pump, so we had to take it into town. The front tire we filled with no issues, but the back tire, he overfilled it and it popped so loud it scared both of us, and I was immediately crushed. I thought, oh, there goes my week with my bike. I must have looked pretty forlorn because my grandfather said, not to worry. We drove to the sporting goods store and they happened to have an inner tube that fit, and after my grandpa paid, he said he'd never worked on a bicycle before. So the store manager laughed and chided my grandpa for not knowing anything about bicycles and was giving him a lot of grief. And I remember thinking, like, he kind of knows my grandpa. So on the way back, we stopped at my grandpa's favorite bar called Star Corners. It was a log cabin structure quite a ways out of town. It was on the main road, but it was kind of in the middle of nowhere. It's since been torn down and that corner is empty. And I think about my grandpa all the time when I drive by there. We sat down at the bar. Nobody else was there. It was early afternoon. Without asking, the bartender brought my grandfather a Budweiser, and he turned to me and says, what would you like? And I said, I'll take a Coke. So we enjoyed our beverages, and then my grandfather got up and said, we go now. We walked out. As we got to the door, I said, oh, Grandpa. I pulled on his sleeve. I said, Grandpa, you didn't pay. And he turned around just as the bartender said, see you, Aatu, have a fantastic weekend. Patted me on the shoulder and said, we not have to pay here. So we went back to the cabin, and I kind of forgot about that. Well, years later, my dad and I stopped into Star Corners for a beer, and we sat down at the table, same one. It hadn't changed in those 10 years, but I was looking around and feeling really nostalgic, and they brought our beers, and after the first sip, I said, I remember I came in here with Grandpa and I told my dad about the story with the bike and the back tire, and I said, yeah, Grandpa didn't have to pay. My dad took a long pull on his beer and he gave me this look and he said, do you know why Grandpa gets free beer here? I said, no, I just thought he knew the bartender. My dad said, you haven't heard this story before. He chuckled and filled me in on the full story. Well, my grandpa, as I mentioned before, Star Corners was his favorite bar. And he stopped in there early one afternoon, about the same time as he did after my tire popped. I ordered a Budweiser, and the bartender was talking with him, and these two biker dudes come in. And the bartender said, excuse me, Aatu. And he walked over to the cash register and started talking animatedly with these biker dudes, hit the button on the cash register, opened it up, and handed some money over. And my grandfather put his beer down and says, wait a minute, something wrong. And one of the bigger of the biker dudes turned and looked at Grandpa and said, mind your own business, old man. Well, Grandpa picked up his beer and finished it. And my grandfather was not a tall man, but he was fearless. He walked up to the bigger biker dude, looked up at him, and he said, give him money back. And the guy set the money on the bar and turned to my grandpa and took a swing at him. Well, my grandfather was an accomplished wrestler when he was young. Grabbed the guy's arm, threw him down so hard on the ground and knocked the wind out of him. The other biker dude headed for the door. My grandpa picked him up, walked him to the door, and threw him out just like you see in the movies. My grandpa slammed the door, came back and says, give me another Budweiser. Well, the bartender brought him the beer and said, Aatu, you shouldn't have done that. My grandpa said, why? He said, those guys are going back to their gang and they're bringing them all here and they're going to trash this place. My grandpa said, well, we'll see about that. Bartender said, you don't understand. This biker gang, we've had a real problem with them all over the country. They're stopping in and wrecking places if they don't give them money. So Grandpa said, let's call the police. The bartender says, you know what? I got a better idea. So he picked up the phone. Well, he was married to a Chippewa woman who had a lot of brothers and a lot of cousins. So after this call, they all showed up. My grandpa explained what happened, and they immediately took a liking to my grandpa. Sure enough, the bikers returned, and the obvious leader came in and looked at my grandpa and said, one of my guys told me you threw him out of this place. And Grandpa said, he was stealing from my friend. That's not right. My grandpa walked up to him and looked up at him and held out his hand and said, I want no trouble. Let us shake hands. Well, my grandfather was a sailor on the Swoman Yotson for over 3 years, and he was in charge of the forward mast at the very top, and he had developed these hands that were like solid steel. He could crush just about anything. And I remember as a kid, we always used to shake Grandpa's hand and try to squeeze it, and you couldn't squeeze it. It was like solid granite. So he holds out his hand, and the biker dude reaches out and grabs my grandpa's hand, and my grandpa immediately squeezed down with his right hand. Surprised the guy. He actually went down on a knee because it hurt so bad. My grandpa took his left hand, put it on the guy's shoulder and squeezed, and he yells in pain. My grandpa picks him up and walks him to the door and throws him out just like he did to the other guy. My dad shakes his head and said, "That's when all hell broke loose." He said, "Those biker dudes just started swinging. Those Chippewas started swinging. Grandpa's right in the middle of it, not taking, I mean, he won't back down from anything." Eventually the police showed up and they put some of those biker dudes in the back of their cars. Everybody was beaten up, but it was pretty clear that the guys from Star Corners had won that battle. The bikers never came back. Well, Grandpa went home, and Grandma looks at him and starts fixing up his cuts and bruises. And well, my dad happened to show up. He looks at my grandpa and says, "What happened?" And Grandma says, "Ugh," and walks out. And my grandpa said, it was nothing. Well, the next day, my dad and grandpa go in again in the early afternoon to Star Corners, and the bartenders there immediately brings 2 beers to my dad and my grandpa, and all those Chippewas are in there. And they come up and sit around, and the bartender slaps my grandpa on the back and says, "Aatu, anytime you're in here, you're never paying for a beer." Dad looks at him and looks at these other guys and says, "What happened?" And they relived the story. Every one of those guys was telling a different piece of it, and my dad said by the time they were done, they slapped grandpa on the back and said, "You're an absolute legend." As a matter of fact, one of those guys was the manager of that sporting goods store that fixed my bike tire. And when we were done, my dad laughed and shook his head remembering the story and said, "Grandpa was tough, and the thing that made him really angry was when anybody was being pushed around." The moral of that story is you don't mess with Aatu, especially after a few beers. That reminds me of a joke. Danny's in class and the teacher decides to teach them about moral, as in the moral of a story. So she explains that a moral is really what the story is about. It's a lesson that we learn from the story. So she gave the kids an assignment. She said, "I want you to go home this weekend and I want you to come up with a story with a moral." So they come back on Monday. She calls on little Susie and then Jimmy, and finally she calls on Danny in the back, and she always hesitates to call on Danny because he's always got some wacky thing to say. So Danny comes up and says, "Oh, my Aunt Jenny was in the military. She was a pilot of an A-10. Somewhere in the Middle East, she was giving some close air support to some Marines who were in a real battle, and she got shot down. She was able to crash the plane just over a knoll from where this battle was happening, and she was able to eject. Just as she ejected, she took inventory, and she found in her pack a full bottle of vodka and a 45 with 10 bullets and 1 in the chamber. So as she's coming down, she notices there are 12 enemy soldiers coming after her, kind of surrounding her position. So as she was floating down, she shot 11 of them with the pistol, and the last one she beat unconscious with that pistol and the empty bottle. The teacher and the class are totally silent. The teacher says, "My gosh, Danny, that's such a violent and horrifying story. What could possibly be the moral to that?" And Johnny looks up and says, "You don't mess with Aunt Jenny when she's been drinking." Hey, if you like that story, please hit the like and subscribe button. And thank you so much for watching. My name is Rusty Korhonen.